Oh boy, so The Last of Us episode 8 was pretty scary and brutal to watch at times, and there's a lot of things to analyze here coming from the subversion of some character dynamics as well as some vile intentions hidden beneath the surface for David and how he disguises that through some sort of pretend generosity. I want to dive right in talking about David's patriarchal society and his position of power, and I think a good way that we can get a better look into this is the dichotomy between how he treats Ellie versus his own people. When he's preaching to his little town at the beginning of this episode, there's an uneasiness in the air that's really hard to quantify. We don't know where this is coming from. But then, so we're already unsure of his intentions, but when he meets Ellie for the first time, the uneasiness kind of amplifies because of how calm he is. He's held up at gunpoint, and he just decides to offer Ellie this penicillin. He doesn't even flinch at the problem in front of him. At first, we might suspect that this is some sort of religious altruism coming from his background here, but this is juxtaposed against these really tense conversations he has with James, his fellow hunter, played by Troy Baker, the guy who plays Joel in the game. These conversations, he talks to him about faith and non-belief, and you can tell that James is on edge and that he's scared of David. We later come to understand the abuse that David is putting this group through. It's clear that he sees himself as the superior, and he is the guy calling shots, making all the decisions, which we find out includes even them cannibalizing people. He looks down on the members of his group. He sees them as weak. He calls them sheep, and we see this very specifically when he slaps that little girl who just lost her father, somebody who probably can't quite quantify what that death means, and he just takes out his rage on her. Immediately after, it's even worse because he forces her to come back to him to accept him again. He holds out his hand and forces her to take it while sort of scolding her mother with a look and scaring her into submission. Nearly every situation we see, David is in a position of power, and he's very confident in this, but he's also maybe not careful enough to avoid overconfidence. He'll continue to take advantage of this fear that he has around him, but as the episode plays out, we will also see the downfall of his narcissism. And that's where Ellie comes in. For much of the episode, she's kind of a foil to David. She's sort of helpless and doesn't have many options. When she's first talking to David in the little hut where they have their fire, she's lulled into the story and loses her awareness, which leads to James getting the jump on her in an ambush. But David saves her, giving her the penicillin, giving her a way out, even though in that situation, in some way, she had been beat. She then runs away in fear and desperation, trying to get back to Joel, but her problems aren't over. She doesn't even know where to inject this penicillin, so she's sort of helpless there. But then at the same time, in the back of her mind, she knows that these guys are probably coming back for her to get their revenge. I just love this scene because it reminds me of sort of an old Western, and Ellie does her final stand riding out on horseback, and she tries to lead them away from Joel, but she's unfortunately bested by their numbers. We're seeing her and Joel's roles reversed, whereas we've seen Joel as the protector for so long, even though we might have felt that Ellie was capable. Ellie is now required to protect Joel because he's down there in that basement, barely able to walk and still able to defend himself, as it seems. But we're going to see more of this subversion come to a head as this episode continues. So just as Joel has failed at various points in this show, you have Ellie, who doesn't know how to use the penicillin. She just takes her best guess. She's ambushed. She doesn't get away on the horse. And now she's locked in a cage, helpless again. Yet, oddly enough, this is kind of where we see the first major subversion of power dynamics in this episode. As the situation develops with Ellie locked up, David's confidence builds. He uses his abusive tactics to make Ellie feel alone and isolated from the group, maybe that Joel is dead, and like the only place for her to run is into his arms. His narcissism has grown so far that he knows that he has already won. He can trust Ellie to play into his fantasy, but that's really only in his own head, and Ellie has other intentions. Ellie pays it forward from earlier in the episode, and this time she lulls David into his own story, and then when she sees the opportunity, she plays him and she breaks his fingers. Even worse for David, he laid it out before her. He tells her that she has a violent heart, and then he falls into his own trap. She disguises this violence and then wins with it. She then adds on telling him her name when he's already at the bottom, and now he knows that he couldn't get that out of her. She did it voluntarily, and therefore he lost in an even bigger way. In turn, David is furious, and he is about to return with even greater violence. As this is happening, Joel has woken up and is brutally fighting his way out of a situation and finding his way back to Ellie. Despite the early role reversal, we're sort of at a crossroads now where Joel has returned to being this violent protector who will mercilessly kill to save the people that he loves. With that first guy that he kills in the basement, there's just this desperate sense of, I wouldn't even call it self-preservation. It's, he knows that Ellie is counting on him to get back to her, and that's where he is just fighting for his life. All the while, Ellie cleaves her way out of death once again, outsmarts her opponents, and then this leads into her showdown with David, the real final stand. Ellie and Joel are in this us or them kind of situation, and I think it's interesting looking at this piece versus some other areas in the show of how we can justify the violence in this in some ways. The final moments of David just leave you feeling disgusted and violated from even just watching because he's so horrible. It's disturbing, and we see greater violence from Ellie than we've ever witnessed before. She has to take over for what Joel has maybe done in the past, but this is personally motivated, and it's understandable. She's traumatized, and she brutally kills David and changes something in her head. You can see as she walks out that door at the end that a switch has flipped, and she's never going to be the same. I love the subtle metaphor of Ellie literally leaving the fire as it's burning behind her, just this complete blaze of awfulness that has taken over her life. And right as she does, Joel arrives, and she doesn't even realize that it's him because she's so caught in the horrific events that have just occurred. And I think what this final moment brings us is it shows that Joel also has to change in this moment. As Ellie started out the episode as the protector with Joel injured, by the end, she's a kid again, haunted by horrible memories. And that's when Joel comes in and says, "It's okay, baby girl." If there was one line in the show that is meant to immediately bring out tears, that was it. It's just perfectly delivered and perfectly written for this moment. Joel shows us what a good father does and what a good father he can be. And it's this massive irony compared to the horrible patriarch that we've seen for the entirety of this episode. And just as importantly, Joel didn't save the day. The way he's saving the day at the end here is he is the emotional protector. Ellie managed to do all of this essentially by herself, but this is where Joel is actually needed to help her through the trauma of this situation. Going forward, I'm really curious to see how this dynamic between Joel and Ellie plays out, if they'll sort of stay in this situation. Compared to trauma that came up in like episode 5 or past episodes, it doesn't really seem like they can just move on from this, especially from how the reaction happens. Compared to episode 5, where Ellie just kind of goes off down the road, this one, they have to hug it out, and you can just feel how different this is. Like, given the context, it's obvious. With reference to this new relationship, I'm sure that the season finale will bring a lot to the table, and I'm sure there's a lot of excitement in store for the final events of the show. So check back for my review on that next week. See you then.